Good evening. My name is Jacek Bartosiak. Welcome to Strategy and Future. With me, we are having today Albert Świdziński, Director of Analysis at Strategy and Future. So, all in family. And we are going to discuss two, in our opinion, most seminal issues nowadays that will take us forward into the future. The first one is the sequencing strategy that apparently United States adopted somewhere, a few months prior to the war in Ukraine, or at least it was signaled, at least in some writings, that the United States might be willing to adopt it. And we will be discussing whether it's true, whether we really think so, and so on. I don't want to jump into hasty conclusions. I want you guys to learn what we both want to share with you. And the second issue, which is related to that, is this temptation of limited warfare, assuming that so far the United States has been doing very well in terms of strategic mastery and keeping the war limited in Ukraine and without actually casualties on the U.S. side, without without boots on the ground, without all other elements of engagement, commitment that usually the great power would have to provide in order to prevail, and the Russian foe is being entreated in accordance with the sequencing strategy. We think that the United States might be tempted to think that it can really control escalation within the concept of limited warfare, given the multitude of contemporary domains of competition, from technology through trade and even kinetic warfare, and that might take us to open war with China. Pardon me for this lengthy introduction, but this is such a heavy subject, and both subjects are so heavy, so I had to do it like that. And now, Albert, the floor is yours. Let's start with the sequencing strategy, what it is, how it was defined apparently by Wes Mitchell in Foreign Affairs, I guess, or National Interest, I remember well. And let's try to figure out step by step what it entails and whether this was really a genuine strategy and why we think it might have been so.
I mean, look, I'm about to launch into a very prolonged tirade of my own as well here. Look, we knew about sequencing before, and we spoke about this, I think, even on our English speaking podcasts, definitely on Polish ones, and we wrote about it as well. The thing is the way it was presented by Wes Mitchell, and well, first he wrote a historical really backgrounder as to how empires managed two simultaneous adversaries that are pure competitors, because this isn't something, obviously this isn't something unheard of. It happened before.
He gave a few examples: Ottoman Empire, Venice Empire, the trading empire, other empires that were always reluctant to face two foes at the same time. So the preferred option was sequencing them.
I mean, the preferred option was co-optation. The preferred option was your enemies don't really want to fight you because they accept your leadership. But that ship has sailed for the United States, I do believe, when it comes to Russia and China. So it was a very interesting concept. First, you wrote it for Marathon Initiative, and that was this long historical study with numerous examples.
And also for Office of Data Assessment, I guess. It was a paper prepared for the Pentagon's Office of Data Assessment, as you well know, our audience well knows, and inside think tank working for Secretary of Defense, created by Andy Marshall in the 70s and run by this great figure until he was 90-something. Yeah, go ahead.
And you met him as well, which is quite interesting story in its own right. But yeah, also, I mean, since we digress a little bit and are having a flow in conversation, let me just say that, because again, it was absolutely that. Yeah, it was published it was one of the studies, I guess, that was commissioned by the ONA, But the interesting part is, of course, that it was a very state historical document. You could stumble upon it in a book, I suppose. It would be a great book chapter, but it was a very state analysis of what states did and how they managed this problem. And then, of course, we found it very interesting. Then there was West Mitchell writing in the national interest, where he laid out what he wants to see, well, how the sequencing should look vis-a-vis China. Pardon my clock right there. It's midnight here in Poland, so it's going it's going nuts. But yeah, so he laid out more of a focused and less historical, description of how sequencing should look vis-a-vis China and Russia, and how really Ukraine should become what Afghanistan once was to the Soviet Union in the 80s. A means of sapping strength and stuff like that. The goal was to basically block westward expansion of Russia permanently here, so that it can't really think about any. It can't really portray itself as a part of security architecture in Europe, and ultimately is forced to redirect to east. So that was, that's a long story short. We can't really get over the finer details, but that was what West Mitchell presented. The thing is, um, it was West Mitchell, right? West Mitchell. Well, I'm not sure if, like Elbridge Colby, was closely related to the Republican establishment, but he came up with it in July 2021. Again, sequencing is an old
Yeah,
strategy.
and formerly under Trump, he was the
Sure, exactly.
Deputy
Yeah, of course.
Secretary for Eurasian European
Eurasia.
Matters.
Yeah, that's right.
Eurasia. He was responsible for Mackinder's middle tier countries, including Poland and Ukraine,
Yeah,
and all those countries that separate Russia and Germany
sure.
and prevent, on behalf of the sea power of the United States, the continental consolidation of Eurasia and Europe under the behest of the so to say, the powers that are not sort of favorable to U.S. presence and U.S. leadership in the Eurasian landmass, far away from this high seas.
Mhm.
So but I wanted to say that sequencing strategy, as portrayed by Mitchell and demonstrate later on, had two legs at least. One leg was, of course, the attrition, the planned attrition of the Russian forces, probably at the time, by sapping the strength in some sort of insurgency in the Western Ukraine, which at the time was thought as the only viable option. It turned out better because Ukrainian army, as you know well, stood out and sort of fought bravely and has been fighting since then. But the second leg, which is also very important and often omitted, especially by us and people dealing with kinetic exchanges on battlefield, was that the sequencing presented in this way had the capacity to shape coalitions that served the United States strategic interests. So, in case of Europe, sequencing created the perfect conditions for creating anti-Russian, anti-hegemonic coalition in Russia, which is good enough and strong enough for the United States to stay aloof
Mm.
and
I
only
mean,
commit over, from far away in offshore balancing, because the coalition itself is strong enough, because Russia is not that strong enough, and the attrition is manageable in
uh,
terms of escalation. And the United States created a coalition, and at the same time, it wanted also to shoot another Turkey by that, because it also enabled them to create a platform of pushing and advocating for decoupling from China by, attaching China onto the same platform as Russia as a revisionist power, and shaping the reception of the Western societies that those are antagonistic powers that want to change the status quo
sure.
and their tranquility of those people.
I mean, ultimately, you're completely right, and it
And the
was the
United
attempt.
States have been great at that.
Sure,
Maybe
because
with China it hasn't worked perfectly, but it has worked better than I for sure
again, the
experienced.
goal was to permanently block Russia's propensity to expand west, force it to redirect its energy east, and then really when you speak of coalitions, the ultimate goal of sequencing was that when it went to its logical conclusion would be to form a coalition that would, because you redirect Russia's energy east,
Yeah.
where it can really come into conflict with China. So the ultimate goal of sequencing was really to create certain conditions for having a more amicable relation with Russia itself, right, against China. So when you speak of coalitions, the ultimate goal of that was that at the end of the day, because
Yeah,
that
maybe
that kind
still
of
it's still
coalition.
in the cards somewhere in the
Sure, I'm
future.
not saying this happens, but in the perfect scenario, this is what it
Yeah.
was, and this is what Mitchell was.
Yeah,
I
but
do believe Wes Mitchell was thinking about, even though he was more skeptical when it came to Ukrainian propensity to fight Russians back. But again, everybody was very
yeah, and still,
skeptical.
it was really a masterpiece at the time when we suspected with Albert that the United States might be contemplating it.
Mhm.
We thought that this is too savvy. I think too precise. It would have to be too precisely, how to say it in English, knitted or
It, as
crafted to really deliver
I
with
mean, it
all.
has all the downsides of a conspiracy theory, because I guess we're still, the interesting part was that it was out in the open when we had that
Yeah,
interaction. That was out in the open that Washington was interested in sequencing for a number of reasons which we could discuss, and certain people were not happy with how it's going, and that's stunning. That admission, we cannot reconsider this admission because nobody in the administration said that there is sequencing, but
but
well,
recently, in your even exchanges on Twitter,
yeah.
prominent representatives of strategic circles in US sort of started
Yeah,
admitting that this is, in cards. I mean, the
and it's
sequencing strategy was in the
yeah,
thinking, and what why it is so, unpleasant to talk about it is that for the sequencing
very
strategy
difficult
to start
question.
working
Yeah.
at all, there had to be a calibrated deterrence fiasco
Well,
in
well,
place.
if you want to engage with your enemies, there has to be an opportunity to engage, right? So,
Mhm.
well, the good thing is, and the stunning thing is that, again, we're moving, we're still operating within assumptions, right? At the end of the day, but the thing is, it would show a tremendous continuity in the U.S. government, because this was, again, administration to administration, right? And between Trump and Biden, there was seemingly a lot of differences. But if sequencing was set up the way it was set up, assuming we're correct, then we have a lot of consistency. Again, from West Mitchell as a Trump man to Biden realizing the strategy still.
Yeah, no, and also this connection between the Republicans and the Democrats, as if a deep state, and at least in strategic terms, really existed, or at least
Was
had
or
a common wisdom, or
in
at
the
least.
right in the right if you're looking at continuity of cadre stuff like that, right? I'm gonna
Yeah.
be the one hold, but again, as you said, this assuming sequencing was something that Washington thought about when forming its strategy and how to manage Eurasia. Then, of course, yeah, you could ask a lot of questions that are difficult, because, again, to engage in sequencing first with Russia, and then this allows you to manage China. You have to engage with Russia in some way, uh, and to do that, again, the thing is, of course, you can't come you cannot really control whether Vladimir Putin decides to attack, and you can't control whether Zelensky decides to book it on day one, right? This is outside of anyone's control. But what you can do is you can shape both
um,
perceptions, so shape the battlefield, so to speak, shape the realities on the
before
battle.
kinetic encounter
And
occurs.
again, and this goes back to our observation from last year, where we had three unique things happening. The three unique things that the US did. One of them was particularly unique. So you had the US failed to deter. There was an abject deterrence failure when it comes to Ukraine, right? And
Yeah.
apart from most drastic things like sending troops into Ukraine, which would probably be pretty effective as a deterrent, but unlikely. The US could have done a lot of things, like, for example, retain strategic ambiguity when it comes to what it will do should Russia attack. It didn't. It said we won't send troops.
Yeah,
You
and
know,
also that the minor incursions
and
will not
minor incursions.
will be sort of not, you know counter acted upon or something like that, Biden
And
stated,
this
yeah?
is fully understandable. The US doesn't want to engage in a war that has a potential to escalate to a nuclear exchange with Russia. That's understandable, but it also had an effect of failing to deter the Russians.
Yeah.
What it also did, the US is, because if you don't want to fight that war and you don't want to risk deterring, the natural thing to do would be to comply with some of the demands that the aggressive side does, right? This is what you do.
And this is what Russians expected, actually.
This is they had a broad set of conditions, the Russians. The US didn't do 1938, it didn't do Munich, so they
It
didn't
did. Yes, it did.
appease.
And also, they in the information domain, they behaved a little bit in a teasing way by disclosing information that was calling this bluff. That,
Which they
that,
never
that,
never
that, that
done
was
before.
calling something that the Americans were saying is a bluff, or made an impression that the Putin is bluffing. And in order to save his face, he had to do
Okay.
something. And allegedly, he changed the operational plans at the last moment, complicating for the Russian military the main axis of advances. Of course, there will be books about it. We are not sure what we're saying now without that, but it might be so, and that created quite complicated operational conditions for Putin to carry through his political objectives, given the cold bluff of sort of playing around this thing. Sort of, I don't know. But there
Well,
was a major game behind the curtains and information domain in this.
which never happened before. The
How do you
US
say it in English? Political maneuvering. Yeah, sort of power brokering, power game between those two powers, with Ukraine being a battlefield, battleground
So
prior
so
to the war itself,
prior to the war. So
and
the
also visits of Burns,
Oh
CIA
yeah, in
CIA
both
chief,
Moscow.
was seen as a sign of weakness
Mm.
and readiness for concessions. And the question is whether they did it well, maybe they did. The Burns and other guys did it on purpose
So
to
so
to create conditions that the
Mm.
West and the United States is weak.
So again, you could always argue that they didn't want to really, they failed to deter for obvious reasons. The most obvious one being they don't want to be engaged in a direct war with Russia. You can say they also failed to do appeasement because they obviously want to. They see it as a threat. If you have a state-on-state aggression, full scale war, that's a threat to the system, right? When you have such a major player as Russia going against all the rules, that's a threat to system. So they didn't want to do it. And then the intelligence sharing that happened, which never happened before, you could argue that the US wanted to, for example, bring up its credibility after Afghanistan, after the fall of Kabul. Remember, that was August,
Yeah,
pretty much exactly a year ago. So those things are fully understandable, whether intended or not. Their effect was that it created a reality when it was more like it maximized chances of Russia making a move.
oh
The
yeah,
decision. So I guess this is where we put it. It maximized chances of Russia
yeah,
making a move on the Ukraine, whether by intent or whether by
yeah.
design or accident, doesn't really matter.
Yeah,
I mean,
at the same time, having said all this, with all things being equal, I need for sure on my side to underline that the strategic how the United States delivered so far in terms of its interest in this war has been a strategic masterpiece. And I have not expected over the last 7 years when I was dealing with this issue that the United States leadership would really deliver such a feat of masterpiece, and that is promising for the United States and its interest in the coming confrontation with China, or maybe the already pending confrontation with China, that there is still a capability to deliver a strategic masterpiece. Uh, at the same time, and I'm just hint, maybe we'll record another podcast on that. This, success in keeping the war limited. We've been discussing that before with Albert. Uh, Controlling the escalation and creating the perception that the Russians sort of accept that the escalation is like that. Yeah, deterring from war with NATO, with horizontal escalation, with and still keeping this war limited and treating the Russian forces and sequencing strategy success. And also the great success of diverting strategic flows, natural gas, oil, Russian economy moved towards Asia, apart from Europe, which sort of anchored European powers with the NATO, with North Atlantic community, more than it had been accepted before war started, is a great US success. And this might tempt the US leadership to try the same thing against China. Given the existence of thermonuclear weaponry, the World War is out of question in the form that we knew in the 20th century or Napoleonic Wars, that everything is on the table, we fight at all the big battles, because the Americans may think that scalable world war is deliverable by imposing on technology, trade, shaping coalitions in Asia, cutting off here, adding there, helping there, financial war, and limited land war like Vietnam or Korea, some naval encounters in the South China Sea or Taiwanese Strait, that they can control it. And they will be capable of creating coalitions that will do the heavy lifting for the United States and treating China, diverting it, or derailing China's growth, derailing Chinese stability in this manner without having heavy risk of for the United States somehow. Of course, we are right now moving to the vague, very dangerous waters and very vague. So pardon me that we are doing the vague manner, but of course we'll do our best. At Strategy&Future, we are preparing a major presentation that is trying to disseminate, detect all those trends in detail and describe them in strategic terms. So we are very early into this thinking, but there might be this temptation of success, of limited world war in Eurasia, because the United States has been doing great so far, which is a good thing for Poland. Basically, we are happy about it without that. At Strategy, it's not so that we are criticizing the United States. We understand that there is a proportionality of goods, and it's much better not to have a nuclear war against Russia, and it's much better not to have full-scale world war with Russia, even if Ukraine is treated in this way and treated instrumentally. But of course, it doesn't prohibit us from thinking about Polish interests, and this is why we're saying it to you guys.
I mean, goodness gracious, who doesn't treat anybody else in international politics instrumentally? There is nothing else, and that's fine. As long as everybody realizes that this is the case, it's reassuring in a way. You know what to expect. The problem becomes when somebody stops doing that and starts behaving like Poland did throughout history, irrationally and based on very very shaky grounds, right, and acting romantically. Then it's a problem. Then it's somebody who you can't really read and predict and control. So that's not good. But yeah, look, when you speak of sequencing, yeah, I agree, it was a resounding success. That was really the beginning of my very short exchange with some of the American
Including Elbridge Colby himself, who wrote the
yeah.
Strategy of Denial, where he, in his Marvel's book, by the way, also a major craft, strategy mastery.
The Strategy of Denial.
Yes, Strategy of Denial, where he proposes shaping the alliances in Asia in the same manner.
But I still fail to understand the basic thing is, the basic, I think, flaw in his reasoning is still assuming that Europeans will act like status quo was untouched should they fail in Ukraine. And this is, I think, the main, because you could say that, his argument was that strategy of denial is no good because it was supposed to be a quick turnaround and focus on China. And it never was. The quick turnaround was never the priority because, again, we spoke about this, the US had to manage escalation, right? So any idea of winning, whatever winning might be, and that's very important to define it, took second place to making sure that there is no inadvertent and uncontrollable escalation between the US and Russia, which then dictated that really Ukraine cannot be given enough equipment to quickly win
Yeah.
because that was risky, and the US didn't really know how to test Russian red
Yeah.
lines and what they were.
And
So
there
that
has
was the priority,
and that
right?
was first time in history. The war is close to the Russian heartland, in the proximity of Moscow, against nuclear power. There are no boundaries. You know, the boundaries were supposed to be drawn by this war. So it's a completely different story from Cold War. I think it was much more escalatory potentially and dangerous than all Cold Wars
And Russia's way
encounters.
weaker too, so it's really it's
If
tethering, yeah,
yes, exactly.
on the brink. And then but here's the thing. So again, for me, there is no doubt that sequencing, if it was in fact implemented, was a resounding success. But I guess apart from this, what I said, that the biggest problem with what Elbridge Colby says and others say that criticize U.S. continued presence in Europe is the assumption that Germans would just pick up the pace and build up military and everything would stay as it was. It wouldn't. There is literally nobody west of Oder that genuinely needs the United States in Europe. It serves no point in Europe. It doesn't really. Russia is not an existential threat.
Yes, it is for the intermarim countries
It is for us, but
that we represent.
I'm sure there is a deal could be made, between West and East when it comes to us and what exactly goes to whom. That's fine. But west of Oder, there is no perception of Russia an existential threat, which is completely understandable because Russia is not an existential threat. There won't be first guards charging Berlin. That's not going to happen.
And that was not also
The point.
threat. Yeah, no point, no threat, no capabilities.
And
that
then
it was well read by
and
also
sure.
German, I would say.
And then what's the point of the US being in Europe? It's a spoiler. If you want to have a good trade with China, the US is a major spoiler. If you want to have your cheap energy coming from Russia, US is a huge spoiler, and it costs Germans their economy pretty much.
Yeah.
Everybody's well, imagine you're German. Imagine you're the chancellor and you're reading your Financial Times, and some witty guy in London says you're the sick man of Europe because your economy's messed up. That's outrageous. Das ist ein Skandal. So this was the cost that Germany suffered. And again, this coalition building, which happened sort of reflexively, I suppose, even after Ukraine. Again, after it became clear that you can't really wash your hands because Ukraine's gonna fall in the week and it's gonna be over, and unfortunately you have to power on. This really changed the equation, but nobody's particularly happy about this because Europe's suffering here. And it's also suffering doubly because US, has its industrial policy, which sucks out all the investment from Europe. So nobody in Europe really needs the United States over here. There is no other than some romantic memories of common shared friendship and transatlantic alliance and Omaha Beach and stuff like that. It's a huge spoiler for business for everybody west of us.
And of course, in the years where the Eurasian landmass was consolidated, also thanks to the growth, the rise of China.
So if the US would wash its hands, do a quick turnaround, or not even do a quick turnaround, but focus over there, we would be, it would be fairly easy to manage the cordon sanitaire made out of Poland's, Belarus's, Ukraine's, and neutralize their objections.
And that was expected after the Kabul debacle.
Yeah, this is what we all expected, right? And how we exactly find ourselves in there and make sure that we have to accommodate to others, interests, not exactly go out there, on our shield and fight the Russians, because then you would have a common, cohesive, or you'd have a prospect at creating a cohesive, economic ecosystem from Lisbon to Vladivostok to China, really. The entire Eurasia that will operate in a economically feasible way. It's a wonderful thing for billions of people living here, however you want to call it. Horrible for us, we would be under the boot. But if you look at the gross amount of people that will benefit from it, quite likely
Western Europeans.
And
That's
this is
why,
why you have to have the US over here.
yeah, exactly, exactly. And this is why we think sequencing strategies work perfectly well for the United States. And our suspicions touching on conspiracy theories at the beginning of this war, apparently, has have been in a way not proven right yet, but maybe facts on the ground sort of suggest that that might have been the case, but also increasingly voices from DC itself criticizing the sequencing strategy these days, that all hands should be already in Asia, because sequencing strategy is also too burdensome for the United States, even despite being such a success. And basically, even on Twitter, Albert was in some sort of argument with those people, professional circles that were uh, uh, voicing those concerns in the US.
That is correct. That is
That is
correct.
correct. Let us put an end here to our conversation. And maybe during our next one of our next podcasts, we'll talk about this temptation that of limited war that might take us to the war with China pretty soon, which is quite not only a challenge but also a fearful thing. Okay, thank you, Albert. Albert Świdziński,
Thank you.
Jacek Bartosiak, Strategy and Future team with you. Stay with us for more podcasts. Thanks.